Good morning. Today's scripture reading comes from Isaiah 6, chapter 1 through 5, and it reads, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord seated on a throne, high and exalted, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphs, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying, and they were calling to one another, 'Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory.' At the sound of their voices, the doorpost and thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. 'Woe to me,' I cried. 'I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. And my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty.'" I've read Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 through 5.
Thank you, Cortez. Good morning again. Go ahead and turn your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12. I hope you paid attention to the text that Cortez read. It's an awesome text. It's one that we ought to read periodically, though it tends to be one that we kind of shelve and don't pay much attention to. James Michener, in his book The Source, tells the story of a man named Urbael, who was a farmer living about 2200 BC. He worshipped 2 gods. One was the god of death, and the other was the goddess of fertility. One day, the temple priest told Urbael to bring his young son to the temple to sacrifice if he wanted his crops to be good. Now, you got to understand what he's saying. Urbael obeys. On the appointed day, he drags his wife and his boy to the scene of his boy's religious execution by fire to the god of death. And after the sacrifice of Urbael's boy and several other boys, the priest announced to the fathers that one of them will spend a week in the temple with one of the new temple prostitutes. Urbael's wife is stunned as she notices desire written on his face like she's never seen before. And then she's overwhelmed when she sees him leap to his feet, lunging forward when his name is called as the privileged one who will spend the week in the temple. The ceremony's over, and Urbael's wife walks out of the temple, her head swimming, concluding if he had different gods, he would be a different man. Michener's language. It has long been asserted that a man becomes like the God he worships. And often the size of man is sorely limited by the size of his gods. Where have all the heroes gone? Is a question we sometimes are prone to ask ourselves. Where have all the heroes gone? You know, history reminds us of a time when our country was privileged to claim statesmen to sit in seats of authority and responsibility in government. Statesmen. Unfortunately, today, about all we can talk into running for office are politicians and shysters. There was a time when real heroes emerged from among us into the arena of sports or military service or local government or even entertainment. Individuals who stood for integrity and honor and truth. There was a time when that was true. I mean, our children collected pictures and baseball cards and magazine covers of honor, or we did as children, we did that. Today, collectibles available to our children our mug shots taken from the latest drug conviction or National Enquirer's latest orgy expose. Things of that nature. Where have all the heroes gone? We live in a world of small heroes because we live in a world of small gods. Never in history of the world have we had so much high-tech capability at our fingertips. I mean, everything, enabling us to communicate with each other no matter where we are in the world. There are all kinds of avenues of communication at any moment of the day. In a society filling up with cell phones and internet phones and email and internet and Facebook and fax machine and TV, and the list goes on, we have become a world community where communication is just kind of instant and automatic, and it's almost total. And yet, at the same time, people are discovering that in the maze of this communication technology, there's a shallowness of the content of what is being communicated. It affects our minds, it affects our spirits, it affects our emotions. Without realizing what's going on, people are being driven by invisible forces that eventually lead them to believe that they are the masters of the universe, or maybe even gods. In one of his books, Robert Bellah tells of a story of Sheila Larson. Sheila Larson was a young nurse that he interviewed in the process of his research. And she described her faith as Sheilaism. And she put it this way, these are her words: I believe in God. I'm just not a religious fanatic. I can't remember the last time I went to church. My faith has carried me a long way. It's Sheilaism, just my own little voice. She's her own God. A while back in Barnes & Noble parking lot, I saw a bumper sticker on the car, and it said, "Be your own goddess." I guess maybe she's her own goddess. We tend to think of paganism as something that is of the primitive past, a long ago, a distant location. That's the way we think of paganism. We think of it something back then, far away. Something like Baal and his, that James Michener tells us about, with his god of death and his goddess of fertility. We think of human sacrifices and maybe dancing around the campfire and ugly masks to scare away the demons. When we think of paganism, that's what we think of. Or maybe we think of the golden calf that we read about in Exodus chapter 32 that the people of Israel built. Unfortunately, I'm afraid that all of that's an illusion, this idea that paganism is something of the distant past. Rather, we live in a world filled with idols. Only our old world stereotypes prevents us from seeing the world as it is, and reality as it is. And so we come to our text, a short text, not a very long text, Hebrews chapter 12, verses 28 and 29. But I want you to pay attention to the word. Since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us be thankful, and so worship God acceptably with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. Notice the wording. We're to worship God acceptably with reverence and awe. He deserves that kind of worship. Well, what are some of the evidences that paganism is among us? Well, without question, one of them is our loss of a sense of awe. In his book, The Trivialization of God, Donald McCullough speaks eloquent words reminding us of this. In fact, he focuses on this very passage that we just read. He said, the New Testament warns us to offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for indeed God is a consuming fire. But reverence and awe have been replaced with a yawn of familiarity. The consuming fire has been domesticated into a candle flame, adding a bit of religious atmosphere perhaps, but no heat, no blinding light, no power for purification. When the English physicist Sir Isaac Newton published his theories on gravitational motion, the universe was no longer seen as a place where God was constantly intervening. But it came to be seen, because of Newton's work, as something else. The world came to be viewed as operating according to rational, empirical, discernible laws. We call them natural laws. The world functions kind of automatically on the basis of natural laws. That's kind of the way we've been taught to see the world. Now, please understand, Newton was a religious man. And he understood that he was discovering laws established by the Creator. And he would worship and he would affirm that Creator very publicly. Unfortunately, as the 18th century progressed, God was pushed farther and farther into the corner. Before long, God was put out of work altogether, with a growing confidence that eventually all things would be explained through refinements of the scientific theory and scientific method. All that remained was a deity who created a clock of the universe, wound it up, and then sat back to let it run its course. And that became the standard perception of who God is. He's kind of the original cause, but that's about all. And of course, it was just one small step from that point to claim that nothing caused it. It just happened. It just happened. Originally, there was nothing. Then all of a sudden, poof, wouldn't you know it, the world came to be. That's the mindset, and that's the attitude that has dominated us for the last 100 years. And it has had a major impact on our society and our world. Now, we may scratch our heads trying to figure that out and find out the reasons by it and how it happened, but it doesn't really cause much in the way of awe. So the first evidence that paganism is real among us is the fact there's not much awe in our world. But the second reason is our impatience with silence. If we go all the way back to Exodus 32 and the construction of the golden calf, it was actually the silence of God that the people could not bear. Moses had gone into the mountain, you remember, and he had been gone for almost 40 days. They hadn't heard anything. God hadn't spoken during that time, and his prophet hadn't spoken during that time. And so they come to Aaron, and when the people saw that Moses was so long coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses, who brought us out of Egypt, we don't know what happened to him." And so Aaron complied and made them the silver calf, a god. Our contemporary culture doesn't handle silence very well either. I don't know if you've noticed or not, but it's true. We don't. What yet remains clear, however, is whether the problem is God's silence or man's noise that's so constant and incessant and so loud that we can no longer hear our God. Too often we don't hear a reassuring voice and we don't feel his arm of support. Where is God when we have such a desperate need? Where is God when we need him? Where has he gone? Why doesn't he speak? Why hasn't he said anything? And the result can be the feeling of loneliness that's so acute and excruciating that we would rather not even think of God than try to deal with the implications of his apparent silence. And so we decide not to believe in him. Marilyn Monroe has become a kind of icon of our society, a symbol in a way of sensuality and the emptiness of our time. Now, I realize she lived a couple generations ago, but her icon is still very real in our society, even today. And Arthur Miller, in his autobiography, Time Bends, tells of his marriage to Marilyn. And he talks about the time during the filming of the movie The Misfits. He watched Marilyn descend into a depth of depression and despair. And his heart was afraid for her life as he watched her growing estrangement and her paranoia and her growing dependence on barbiturates. And one evening after the doctor had left, after being convinced to give her another shot, he was watching her sleep. And he writes these words. He said, "I found myself straining to imagine miracles. What if she were to wake and I were able to say, 'God loves you, darling,' and she were able to believe it? How I wish I still had my religion and she hers." Folks, those are sad words. You see, Miller had no religion, no God to love and protect his beloved in her growing lostness. Because saturated by the noise and the chaos of Hollywood, they both, the silence of God had grown so deafening their ears that they both had discarded their belief in God and had built a golden calf instead. The third evidence of our paganism that's rich among us is our rampant individualism. Individualism as such is not in and of itself a bad thing. I mean, after all, rugged individualism that allowed us to carve out a new nation. It was the rugged individualism that enabled us to become who we are today as a nation. We don't denounce that. And even so, individualism stands strong against peer pressure. Pressure to conform to the culture of us. And so the strong individual will tend less likely to do that. And of course the Bible tells us not to be conformed to the world. And yet at the same time, there is a negative side to individualism. Someone has written, an individualistic Christianity leads inevitably to an individualistic God. And there's certainly plenty of evidence to substantiate that. I mean, all one has to do is just look at the host of individualized religions and religious groups that have multiplied into our society. Nowhere in the world is this kind of fragmentation of faith evidenced, as is true here in our individualized Western world. You know, that chart is just a thumbnail sketch of reality. Multiply that by 1,000 times, and you begin to get a picture of how we are fragmented. Of course, the most extreme result of all that would be the bumper sticker that says, "Be your own God." But by the time you reach that point, you're far beyond religion. You're far beyond a point of faith. But very close to the same place, philosophically, and yet inside maybe the community of faith are those who insist on being their own pope. Now, at this point, you might be prone to object and say, but we're supposed to study the Bible for ourselves. Yeah, that's true. But we're responsible to God for our own Christian walk. Yeah, that's true, but that's a different thing. You see, it's both challenging and humbling to accept the notion of the priesthood of all believers, and we're blessed by that. You know, there's something awesome about the privilege of drawing before the throne of God with our need. And we're given the ability to do that. We don't have to go through some kind of earthly intermediary to do that. So we have been given that privilege. That's true. And it's humbling to realize that my neighbor next door to me has the right to glean life from the holy text just the same as I do as a religious professional. And that's good. But often, too many times, we've distorted that privilege so as to assume for ourselves the right to make ex cathedra pontifications and hand them down to others, or hand them down to the church. Absolute pronouncements on truth, absolute pronouncements on doctrine, absolute pronouncement on interpretations of text where the text has not been quite so explicit. In other words, if that's the way I see it, if that's the way I interpret it, if that's the way I parse it out, therefore everyone else must parse it out that way too, because the way I see it is the way God sees it. And so we make ourselves our own pope. And it may be privatized, or it may be publicized, such as this is truth, or it may be privatized, as in the cases common for postmoderns, this is truth for me. But either way, I'm declaring myself to be my own pope, or maybe even my own God. I think most of us are aware of George Barna. Barna's been involved in doing poster work and analysis work for a whole generation. And in his brief on his latest book, The Second Coming of the Church, Barna compares the modern church to the Titanic. It's a rather humbling comparison. He says it's large, it's elegant, and it's sinking fast. Now, please understand, Barna is not an enemy of the church. He is very much a friend of the church, but in his preface, he describes his book as an urgent plea for Christians to stop dabbling in religion and grow in spiritual maturity so that they understand who God is, the awesomeness of our God. And that's my plea today. Throughout this series, my call is for us to lift our eyes to the horizons and see a greater God so that we can be perhaps a greater people. May God bless us to grow in Him, to grow in our understanding of His awesomeness. We do, as the song says, serve an awesome God. Let me read one more time this text. Stay where you are. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us be thankful. And so, worship